Hi, I'm Burns Hargis, president of Oklahoma State University, and we're here for another edition of Inside OSU, and we have a very special guest today, OSU alum Tim Dubois. Tim is one of the big names in the music business, and has been a tremendous success both as a writer, performer, and as a producer. And so we're thrilled to have you back on campus, Tim.
I'm glad to be here, Burns. It's a real honor.
I should say Dr. Tim.
Well, that's right.
You
Thank
received
you very much.
an honorary doctorate.
I did, and this is one of the few places that you actually can call me doctor. I figured out they don't recognize that outside of Stillwater.
Well, but you've continued to be an academic. I mean, you teach at Belmont and Vanderbilt, don't you?
I do. I'm not currently teaching these last few semesters, but I'm still on faculty there, and I teach. I started there teaching accounting, which is, of course, my academic background from OSU. But the last few years, my second tour of duty there, I've been teaching entrepreneurship and digital media, and it's a fun thing to do. I still enjoy teaching. I've always enjoyed teaching.
Well, let's drop back to the beginning. Where were you raised?
I was raised in Grove, Oklahoma, on Grand Lake. My mother and father were both teachers there, and actually grew up on the farm that my mother was born in, that my granddad homesteaded when it was still Indian Territory, and one of my nephews still owns the home place, so it's still in the family.
Were you involved in music back in those days?
Yes, I actually always loved music. I started singing like everybody else in church, and then the only instrument that I'm really proficient on is trombone, which it's a little hard to write on trombone, but but I picked up guitar in high school. I play a little bit of piano and have enough music theory I can do that. But I started playing guitar in Grove. Played in a band there, a couple bands there. That looking back were very bad. I didn't realize it at the time, but scary part is I realize now what a bad guitar player I am, and I was actually the best guitar player in the band, so it's pretty scary.
So how did you make your way to Oklahoma State University?
Well, there was really never a question. My older brother had graduated from OSU. My mom and dad both worked there on their master's. They ended up graduating from Tahlequah, but they worked on their master's there during summer school. And I went there. I was a very big in 4-H club, so I had been going there for 4-H club roundup since I was 10, 11 years old.
Gallagher-Iba Arena.
That's right. That's right. And I got offers of scholarships, of academic scholarships from several other schools. One of those, that school down there south of Oklahoma City. And it was a bigger money scholarship, but it wasn't, it didn't turn my head at all. I basically came to OSU.
And you majored in accounting.
I did. I should say, I didn't get off to a great start, Burns. I kind of, my first year and a half there, I was having trouble getting the balance between bands, because I was still playing in bands, and beer and books, and the bands and the beer were perhaps kind of outweighing the books there for a little bit, but I ended up getting it turned around. I got married my sophomore year. Had a daughter, and thought, I better get a little serious about this school. And from then on out, why I excelled, I will say.
Well, but you continued your music interests?
No, I didn't play. I didn't play in bands. I always, my whole life, had the affliction of wanting to write songs from the time I was 15, 16 years old, and I figured out somebody had to write these things. Like everybody else, I kind of thought, whoever's singing the song probably wrote it. And then actually I was at a student council camp, and my roommate brought a guitar in, and we were passing the guitar back and forth, and he said, "Let me play you one I wrote." And I literally, it was like the light bulb went off, and I went, my goodness, you know, and he played it, and I thought, well, that's not very good. I can beat that. So pretty much from that point on, I always was interested in writing and continued to write. So even though I quit playing in bands, and even though I was working almost full time and trying to go to school and keep my grades up, I still found time to write when I was at Stillwater the first time.
Well, everybody I know asks people that write music like you do, and we'll talk about it a little bit. You've been very successful in that, to say the least. But some people say the songs just come to them, and they just write them down on the paper.
Right.
Does it start with the melody, or does it start with the lyrics? Or
when I was working as a professional writer, I was what they call a perspiration writer instead of an inspiration writer, which I didn't sit around and wait for God to send me an idea. I was in the room almost every day trying to write. And as one of my good friends and heroes, Bob McDill, said in an interview one day, they asked him, well, you can't tell me that you actually wrote anything that meant anything or had an idea worth writing every day. And he said, no, but I was there in case I did. So, and that's kind of the way I was with my writing. I always tried to have a writing appointment. I prefer to co-write. That's because of my lack of discipline as a writer. I'm much better off if I've got somebody in there with me that is expecting me to show up at 9:30 and stay as long as we're productive. So I have friends who literally say they don't pick up the guitar until they have the idea and they have the inspiration, but that's just never been my way.
it seems like in country music, they take phrases that people use in normal parlance and turn them into a song.
My biggest hit by far is a song that Alabama recorded called Love in the First Degree. And I guess it kind of fits into the inspiration side of it. When you're a writer, while you always have your writer ears on, you're listening to people talk and you're thinking, you know, you're looking for ideas. And I still remember exactly the moment that I had that idea. I was sitting at a corner and it was a hot day and I had the window down on my pickup truck that I was driving, and the guy next to me's radio was blaring, and the newscaster said so-and-so was found guilty of murder in the first degree. And I don't know why, but just because I had that thought I was going to write, I was where I was going, I thought, murder in the first degree, that's a strong term, you know. And by the time I got to the writer's house, I had thought, Love in the First Degree, and I bumped into Jim Shear, one of my good friends, and then we went upstairs and wrote it one day. And,
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now your other song that must have required inspiration or experience was about she got the elevator and I got the shaft.
Yeah. That's my mother's favorite song. That was a Jerry Reed song, and people always ask if that was from experience, and in reality it wasn't. I was still semi-happily married at the time I wrote it. Now it did turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy later in my life, and ironically, as a part of the divorce settlement, she got half of the rights to that song, and so I guess that's justifiable. And that idea actually came from a friend of mine. Just one day said, my first marriage was like a gold mine. The only problem was when we split up, all I got was the shaft. And I just carried that around for me. And then one day when I was sitting there, I said I like to co-write, but I do, when I'm writing something funny, where I can sit there and amuse myself, I can write by myself. So I did write that one by myself.
And then do you put the music to it? Is that?
It depends. I don't necessarily start. I have written complete lyrics and then written the music to it. A lot of the Restless Heart stuff, which is a band that I put together and produced and managed, worked the other way around. The band would do the music, and they would make a cassette of basically just a chord progression with really no melody or anything, but it was just the drums and the guitars and the feel and the change of it. And then I would ride around, you know, in the car or the truck with a cassette in there for sometimes weeks at a time, waiting for, you know, something to inspire me and do it. So I've done it both ways, but usually in a normal writing session, it kind of happens simultaneously. It kind of, you get an idea for a hook, or you get an idea and somebody will take off on a melody or a chord progression or whatever. So there's no set way to do it. I know there are pure lyricists that they just write lyrics. I have met with them before to come to Nashville, and they will bring completed lyrics, and they're looking for a composer to help do it.
But going back to OSU, you actually, as I understand it, did some demo tapes back then.
Actually, I was teaching at the University of Tulsa and driving back and forth to OSU working on my PhD. And I had worked when I was an undergraduate at the audiovisual department there at Oklahoma State. It was on the second floor of the library at that time. And another OSU grad who you know well, Scott Hendricks, who's another member of the Alumni Hall of Fame, he was a sophomore there and was working in the audiovisual department. And my former boss, who was his boss at that point in time, introduced us because he knew I wrote songs and Scott was interested in writing songs. So Scott somehow convinced Floyd that we needed to buy a 4-track recorder for him to record lectures on, which made no sense, but Floyd went along with it, and somehow he got it squeezed through, and we ended up with a 4-track recorder there in the audiovisual department. And that's where the first demos that we made and took to Nashville were done, was right there in the library. And it was
on cassettes, or?
Well, actually, it was reel-to-reel at that point in time. It's hard to think about this, but when we were making those, which was mid-'70s, back there, 74, back in through there, their cassettes had just kind of come out, but they weren't the way that you recorded things. You still recorded on reel-to-reel, and you had to pitch a song or to present a song to a publisher, you had to go to Radio Shack and buy these little 3-inch plastic reels, and then you had to take the 1/4-inch tape and make each song on the 1/4-inch tape, and then they would make you splice paper leader between the songs. And the reason they would do that is because if the song was really bad, they wanted to be able to skip to the next song and not have to look for it. So that's how the first stuff that we did was all done on reel-to-reel tape on those little.
And you did it by hand. You put the tape on the little spool.
You put the tape on the machine.
Oh, and
you
it would,
you had to splice those paper
right.
things in there, though, and that was the way you did it back then.
Well, but you pursued your accounting career even after you graduated.
Well, sure. I actually, when I was doing that, I had left OSU. I graduated, I got my bachelor's in 72, my master's in 73. I went directly to work for Arthur Anderson in Dallas. And actually that's the music that eventually brought me to Nashville, because up to that point in time, I was really not a country music fan. I like Buck Owens and a few people, but I didn't listen to country radio. I was strictly listening to rock and my dad was not a big country music fan. The music that he listened to was crooners and big band and stuff like that. So I didn't grow up around people listening to the Grand Ole Opry. When I moved to Texas in the early 70s, all of a sudden, my friends, my accounting and my attorney friends that worked at Arthur Anderson were taking me out to hear these guys that were playing this Texas version of country music. Waylon and Willie get all the credit, but there was a ton of guys down there, B.W. Stevenson and Jerry Jeff Walker and Ray Wiley Hubbard, and that music I really was attracted to. I liked it. And at about the same time, I started listening to a lot of the California kind of country that was coming out. Brian Ahern records that he produced on Emmylou Harris and Roseanne Cash and the Cherry Bombs, and that was Vince Gill was just getting started back then with Pure Prairie League and some things like that. And those were the influences that influenced me as a writer. Now, when I was working for Arthur Anderson, I was working about 78 hours a week, and I didn't get to pick up the guitar very many times. But I left Arthur Anderson after a very short period of time. It didn't take me very long to figure out I didn't want to be an auditor. And I went to work for the Federal Reserve System as a financial analyst, and all of a sudden I had time to put the guitar back in my hands.
Now you're a federal employee. You're
Now,
a bureaucrat.
that's right. I was a bureaucrat, and I had time to play guitar. And also, that's when I was at the Federal Reserve System. The way I ended back up at OSU was Wilton T. Anderson, who was the head of the accounting department at that point in time and was a huge influence in my life. He and some of the accounting faculty came to an American Accounting Association convention in Dallas, and I ended up meeting with them there. I went over, took off from work and went over to meet him for a drink over at the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas.
Yeah.
And Bill Ross, who had been an OSU accounting professor and had moved to the University of Tulsa, the three of us together hatched a plan for me to come back and work on my PhD, and that's how I ended back up here.
So how did you get from practice? You didn't do your PhD ultimately, did you?
Well, I left here 40 years ago. I lacked one macroeconomics course and turning in a research paper in an accounting theory course to go get this music thing out of my system. I had already had a song recorded. We were already going back and forth to Nashville. And
What was the name of that song?
that song was a very important song. I'm sure a hoarse cry of recognition will come from everyone's voice. It was called A Good Old-Fashioned Saturday Night Honky-Tonk Barroom Brawl. And it was by Vernon Oxford, who was a semi-star on RCA at that point in time. But I actually heard that song on the radio while I was still a PhD candidate, and I was in Stillwater over at 921 South Stanley washing dishes, and it came on a Wichita AM station that you could get at night down here.
I'll be darned.
And that is a moment if you're a writer, you'll never forget it. You know, you hear your first song on the radio.
So is that about when you decided I'm going to go to Nashville? And
Well, I'd already I couldn't put it down, Burns. Quite honestly, it was always there. Even though I was moving forward with the PhD, I think I knew in my heart I was going to have to go do it at some point in time. And what happened was on spring break of 1977, went to Nashville like I did on every spring break and every winter break and everything. I was taking songs out there. And just on a wild hair, I walked into UT Nashville UT had an adult education program in downtown Nashville called UT Nashville, and it was a night school. And I literally, with no appointment or anything, just walked in off the street, walked up to the dean of the School of Business's office and walked in and said, "Hi, I'm Tim Dubois. I'm a PhD candidate from OSU, and I'd like to talk to the dean if he's in." I first asked for the department of accounting, and he wasn't there. But Dean Massey was, and I ended up going in and talking to him. And I didn't say anything about the songwriting thing. I just said that I was coming to the point that I was going to be ABD and probably wasn't going to be able to stay there and work on my dissertation. I was thinking about coming to Nashville. Well, as I was leaving, the accounting department guy came in. And so we had literally probably 2-3 minutes together, and I just told him a little bit of the story. I didn't have a card, and I tore off a piece of paper and wrote my phone number on it and gave it to him. And walked out of there and, didn't think that much about it. And about probably 4 or 5 weeks later, all of a sudden, the phone rang, and it was the guy. It was the head of the accounting department, and I will think of his name in a minute. And it was just, I met you for just a minute in the dean's office, and I know that you're interested in coming to Nashville, but I can't remember exactly when it is. When is it that you're going to be ready to get here? Well, Burns, that's got to be a sign from God, don't you think?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
So I just
There's a song there somewhere.
So I just immediately said, well, I'm going to be ready to come, which I wasn't. I still acting, of course, but I'll be ready to come. I want to come as soon as I can. And he said, well, I had somebody hired for this summer, and they backed out on me. And he said, why don't you go ahead and send me a full resume, and let's talk. Dr. Rowland, that's what was the head of the accounting department. So I ended up moving there, packed up my family. I had a wife and 2 kids by that point in time, living in a little rental house over on Stanley Street, and loaded up a U-Haul truck, and I had a Vegas station wagon.
I remember.
Followed that. I drove the truck. My wife followed me in the car, and we drove to Nashville. And I thought I was going for 2 years. I had talked to my committee and told them what I was doing, and they all thought I was crazy to a person. Sure. I don't think there was anybody that thought, what's this crazy guy going to do? But I wanted to give it 2 years. I went out there, and 2 years into it, I had gotten a couple more songs cut, not enough to feed a family of 4, but I got enough going on, and that a friend of mine talked me. He asked me, he said, why did you ask for 2 years off? And I said, well, I don't know. I just thought it was the right thing to do. He said, well, I wish you'd asked for 3. And he said, I think you're really close. And I ended up staying. And in that next year, I moved over to Vanderbilt. Jermaine Bear had moved there from Oklahoma State, and he brought me over onto the Graduate School of Management over there to teach accounting to their MBA students. And I had 3 #1 songs that year.
Wow. Well, you ended up having 5, didn't you?
Yes, I've had 5 altogether.
And then you had top 20 in the top 10 or 20 or something.
Well, I've had 20 some odd that I wrote that were top 10 or #1s. And then as a producer, I've had a lot more than that because I've produced a lot of records too.
Well, let's get into that. How'd you move from writing into I mean, you basically were producing acts, right?
Right. Producing is kind of a natural evolution for a lot of songwriters because when you are a songwriter, you have to produce your own demos. You have to make some kind of tape that's acceptable to play to people. So that's where I first started producing, was in doing my own stuff. And then Restless Heart, after Love in the First Degree, I spent a lot of time trying to have another one of those great big crossover hits.
Yeah.
I was a huge Eagles fan, and I loved what Alabama was doing because it reminded me of the Eagles, and I felt like there was a need for that in country music. And I wrote a lot of that stuff, and I couldn't really get anybody to record it. I would pitch it in Nashville, and they'd say it was too pop. I'd pitch it in L.A., and they'd say it was too country, and it just didn't work. So I literally built the band, our Restless Heart, to do a group of songs that some of my friends and I had written. And as a producer, you're the guy that's overseeing everything. You're hiring the musicians. You're sitting behind the board with the engineers, the one that's actually twirling all the buttons and everything. But you're the one that's saying that's right, or let's do that again, or whatever. And that's something that I really, really liked in the beginning. I grew later in my career to not like it so much. But
you produced Vince Gill.
No, I didn't really produce Vince. I wrote When I Call Your Name with Vince, which was the song that became his first #1. And I managed Vince, but I didn't produce him.
So who have you managed?
Vince, for a short while. A young man by the name of Keith Urban, back before he was a star. I managed a lot of people before they were stars. I managed Restless Heart. That's how I got started in management. And a group called Foster and Lloyd. And then a lot of acts that are Oklahoma and Texas acts. Over the last few years, I've been involved more with what they call the red dirt scene, or the Texas-Oklahoma scene here. I manage Roger Krager, who's a big name in that marketplace, Wade Bowen, the kid that's...
But didn't you have Brooks and Dunn?
Well, Brooks and Dunn, I think what you're thinking of is I signed them to my record label.
Oh, okay, because you ended up, talk about that.
In 1988, I turned 40 years old, and I had taken the job to be the head of Arista Records, which is a funny story in and of itself. I never intended to run a record label. I never had any intention of it. My imagination wasn't big enough to even think about that. But Clive Davis, who's a legendary music guy, he decided he wanted to open a country label, and I took the interview with Clive so that I could meet him, because I had read his book, and here's the guy that signed Bruce Springsteen, Janis Joplin, Santana. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And I wanted to be able to say I'd met him. So I took the interview, and you know, we just hit it off, and you know, I think I was a little bit cavalier because I didn't think I wanted the job, and he played me some acts that I didn't like, and I told him why I didn't think they would work, and I think that's probably in the end, you know, what got me the job. The fact that the one thing we agreed on were songs. We were both very, very song-driven, and all of a sudden I was running a record label.
Well, Tim, obviously the music business has changed a lot in the years you've been involved in it, and going from those reel-to-reel tapes to streaming on Spotify and Pandora today. How has that affected the music business? Is it harder, better, worse? I mean,
well, it's quite candidly, it's been awful, because starting in 2000, that's where the music industry peaked. It was the U.S. market was a $15 billion market in 2000. And
is that when Apple and iTunes and all?
Well, actually, what was the big problem was Napster, where people came in and started being able to download without paying all kinds of music, and there were other factors involved, but that was the big factor. And it's literally been downhill almost continuously until a couple of years ago. It actually went all the way from 15 billion to a little less than 7 billion a couple of years ago. Now, just within the last couple of years, because of streaming, as you mentioned, things have started to come back a little bit. They're not anywhere back near like where they were, but there's
you were explaining to me that, you know, in the old days when you bought CDs, you bought the whole album. Now you just buy 2 songs.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. And you used to, you know, you used to pay $16 or $18 sometimes for a CD, and now you can stream something, you know, and the record company gets pennies out of it, you know, and the songwriter gets fractions of pennies. But it is enough that's going on that it's starting to have, there's a little bit of optimism involved. The music industry as a whole has been downsizing almost continuously, and that was one of the reasons it was so hard for people trying to get into the music business, because it was truly like a game of real-life musical chairs. There just kept being fewer and fewer jobs. And so for people that were trying to get in, not only were they competing with the graduates of that particular program, that they were coming out of, but they were also competing with people that had 10 years of experience. They didn't lose their job because they weren't doing a good job. They lost it because there wasn't a job there.
Now, you got into it as a songwriter.
Correct.
But you've got accounting expertise. Yes. Has there been a parallel?
Oh, it's been tremendously helpful. I am one of those people that's blessed or cursed with a left brain, right brain conflict, and a lot of creative people just don't have any business instincts at all. They literally, if they love it, they love it, and it never crosses their mind that they have to make a living off of it. That's just what they do. So if you have someone who has the academic training and also has that aptitude for the business side of it and still is creative, that's a rare bird. And all modesty aside, I'm a rare bird. I'm one of those guys that gets both sides of it. I can love an idea or love an artist, but I never quit thinking about, is this really somebody that I can, make money off of and make it work? So that's a huge part. I know that there's a new music program there at OSU, music business program. I think that's exciting. I met with some of the students when I was on campus last time, and that's an interesting deal. It is a calling, not a rational but business decision to be in the music business.
I've done a lot of those.
And that's just the reality of that situation. But the kind of training that they're going to get is going to qualify them for a whole host of other things that maybe are not directly related to music. But as our whole digital media landscape changes and as the way that we discover and consume music changes, they're going to have a good background to do that with.
Well, with that, I want to thank you for doing Inside OSU. It's been fascinating. I could talk to you all day. I know you're getting ready to do the executive briefing for the Spear School of Business. I know everybody's going to really enjoy it.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks for joining us,
You're
Tim.
very welcome, Burns. Thank you.
Well, that's another edition of Inside OSU, this time with Tim Dubois. What a wonderful guest. What a great conversation. We're looking forward to seeing you next time on Inside OSU. Go Pokes!